Hello, my name is Niklas, and this is What is Fascism, What it is not, How you fight it, and how you don't.
A spectre is haunting Europe. The spectre of communism.
Communism is stronger, more determined than ever.
Communism. The communist.
The communist.
The communist.
Dedicated to the establishment of a new order.
Just what is communism?
Welcome to the Spectre of Communism. The media is full of scaremongering and anxiety about the rise of fascism, the danger of democracy being destroyed. But what actual danger does fascism pose today, and what comparisons can we draw with the 1930s? To deal with these questions, we're very happy to have with us Nicholas Albin Svensson, who is a leading member of the Revolutionary Communist International, and he's written the introduction to a brand new collection of writings by the great revolutionary Leon Trotsky and Ted Grant. Democracy, Bonapartism and Fascism, Class Struggle in the 1930s. It's available to pre-order right now from Well-Read Books. I'll put a link in the description to where you can pre-order your copy. Nicholas, a lot of people are saying that fascism is a clear and present danger in our society today, and there are politicians and movements that they cite to justify those concerns. But first of all, what really is fascism? Because when we talk about the Marxist definition of fascism, the definition that Trotsky developed, what we would regard as a scientific definition of fascism, some people say, well, isn't this all pedantry? When I hear right-wing politicians today attacking migrants and sowing racism, and they're coming out with all this nationalist demagogy, and they're undermining the rule of law in order to enforce their will, it looks like fascism to me, so why are we quibbling over words?
Well, I think there is a difference, and we have to be aware of that difference, and it has an implication also for how we act. There is a difference, for example, between someone like Hitler and someone like Trump. And fascism is a tool directed directly against the organizations of working class, and Trotsky described it as the regime of civil war against the working class. The role of fascism is to completely smash and annihilate the workers' organizations, so all elements of workers' power, democracy in a capitalist society. And this obviously also comes with it the abolition of all kinds of democratic rights for anyone else in society as well. But that is the essence of what fascism is there to do, and it's very different to what we are seeing today. It doesn't mean that these parties and individuals who are now coming forward, standing up and wanting to be elected on very reactionary platforms, that there's anything progressive about them. They are still very reactionary, and we are fundamentally opposed to what they stand for. But we have to make a distinction in order to try to understand what it would mean, for example, if they got elected.
There's something that strikes me when you read the panic in the capitalist press about, say, Donald Trump. You're speaking really about the liberal wing of the ruling class, the sensible, quote-unquote, wing of the establishment. There was a headline in Le Monde which says that Trump's first week as president has been enough to give the nightmare of Americans turned to fascism a feeling of reality. And they quote a person called Olivier Manoni, who apparently translated Mein Kampf into French. And it's interesting because what they say in justifying this argument that Trump is in fact a fascist, they say that the degradation of discourse in the vocabulary in the US and in France, because they're also concerned about Marine Le Pen, has paved the way for the lifting of moral barriers, authoritarianism, dehumanization, and therefore potentially fascism. And I think that's actually quite telling, because what it shows you is that for the establishment pundits, for the liberals, it's all about vibes, it's all about style. The thing that they regard as making Trump a fascist, and not, say, Joe Biden, who funded a genocide, who dragged the world to the brink of World War III, who allowed state forces to beat up university students protesting genocide on their campuses, trying to exercise free speech, trampling over democratic rights, deporting migrants, and so on. The distinction is that Trump is more crude, his language is nastier. And if you look at some of the other so-called classical definitions of fascism, like Umberto Eco's, for example, it's all stuff about the cult of action for action's sake, rejection of modernism, fear of difference. I mean, these are all things that you could see in any number of different governments and regimes under capitalism. The thing that the liberals focus on is the surface, it's the language, but the actual content of the bourgeois leaders, the ordinary leaders, the Keir Starmers, the Joe Bidens, that they wouldn't regard as fascists, fundamentally, I'm not saying these figures are exactly the same, their policies are different and they represent different things, but the only thing that makes Trump and Le Pen, for them, stand out as fascist or potentially fascist is the way they speak.
Yeah, and it serves to prettify, basically, democracy and capitalism. Whereas capitalism and democracy is not pretty at all. It doesn't give workers what they need. It doesn't provide them the food that they need to eat. It doesn't provide them the education, the healthcare they need. And it doesn't give them all that many democratic rights either. Biden, Obama deported lots and lots of migrants from the United States, put them in cages and all sorts. And Trump is now doing the same. Now he's using other language to describe it. Some of it is very racist, what he's saying. But if we want to go down to really brass tacks, as I say, what is really the content, what is he actually implementing? Some of it is different, but some of it is very similar. And particularly when it comes to immigration policy, it's a lot of it is noise and bluster to make himself look like he's doing something, rather than actually being fundamentally that different to what Biden was doing.
I mean, this is the point, right? If we were to say that all a regime had to be is racist and repressive to be fascist, then almost every regime, and I'd say every regime under capitalism will qualify. But obviously that's not very useful in terms of the way we define the term and the way that we respond to it, as you say. So let's turn to the book, which is fantastic. I thoroughly recommend it. And Trotsky's definition, which I think it's fair to say we regard as the gold standard. So how does Trotsky define fascism?
There's a quote here from one of the articles in the book called What is National Socialism? And it says, a German fascism, like Italian fascism, raised itself to power on the backs of the petty bourgeoisie, which it turned into a battering ram against the organization of the working class and the institutions of democracy. But fascism in power is least of all the rule of the petty bourgeoisie. On the contrary, it is the most ruthless dictatorship of monopoly capital. And I think this is quite an interesting point that he makes. Like, actually, fascism is this mass movement of the petty bourgeoisie, lumpen layers, and even drags in a section of the working class, but not it's not the main point of support. And and it is designed to smash it lays all the blame for of society's ills on the Jewish people, but fundamentally on workers' organizations. Communists, they were calling all of them communists, Marxism, Judeo-Marxism, and so on. All these kind of terms that Hitler used. Basically, the blame was laid at the working class for having caused all the economic woes, obviously, and Jewish people. But it was obviously not true. But this was the kind of way, and they mobilized the petty bourgeoisie and all the anger and despair that existed in society. They mobilized that against basically working class. But what is created is not a regime of the small shopkeeper, of the farmer who lost his farm because of the economic crisis, but rather it is the most ruthless regime of monopoly capital, of finance capital, which actually, if truth be told, is the biggest enemy of the very petty bourgeoisie that has been mobilized in its defense.
Something that comes very strongly out of the book is that there are lessons to be learned from the 1930s for today. There's limits to all historical analogies, but there are some common features that are instructive about the way that we understand the state of the world and the way that we will have to organize to defend the organizations and rights of the working class in the future. And for me, the two big lessons is, on the one hand, even though the capitalists will like to blame poor and working people for fascism, and you see a similar sort of language today with the way that Trump's talked about by the frock-coated liberals in the press. They'll say, oh, American workers are just stupid. It's the backward blue-collar Americans and it's the hicks in the Bible Belt who are responsible for all of this, and Trump's riding their ignorance to the destruction of American democracy. Similar sort of language has been used throughout history, but as a matter of fact, it's the capitalists who directly funded and facilitated the rise of fascism, and who always, even before then, kept fascism in their back pocket as a reserve weapon should the class struggle reach a point where they weren't able to rule through quote-unquote normal democratic means. So it's the capitalists who are to blame fundamentally for the rise of fascism, assisted by the errors and the crimes of the leaders of the working class. We'll get to all that. And the other thing, which I think will be very familiar to people watching this episode, listening to this episode, is the perils of lesser evilism and the danger that that poses today. So over the course of this discussion, we want to talk about historically how fascism came about, but about those lessons and how applicable they are to the present moment. So can we begin with a little bit of that background? So what sort of world are we talking about that fascism as a mass force is born into?
You have, after the First World War, you have a massive revolutionary wave that sweeps all of Europe. You have the revolution in Germany in 1918, starting in November 1918, if my memory serves me right. Have revolution in Hungary, 1919. You have the Italian revolution starting in 1919, I think, as well, which lasts for a couple of years.
The 2 red years, right?
Yeah. So then you have also movements. There's a big miners' strike in Britain, for example. There is massive movements in Sweden in 1917, 18, maybe into 1919 as well. You obviously have the Russian Revolution, which is the most decisive, has the most decisive impact on all these events as well. So this is the kind of, out of the World War, basically was a massive revolutionary wave. But it was defeated. Not that long after. You have in Germany, wasn't a dictatorship that came to power or anything, but you have basically the moment which the workers had of the possibility of seizing power was missed by 1923-24, and capitalism managed to find a temporary stability. The revolution in Hungary was crushed by the intervention of its neighboring countries. Italy, you have the rise of Mussolini, who came to power in 1922, I believe, and had more or less stabilized himself by 1926, when it really he really clamped down thoroughly. So this was the kind of tumultuous situation that we find ourselves in. In the mid-1920s to late 1920s, you have stabilization, and this was in Germany but also elsewhere, punctuated by some big struggles, like in Britain, for example, the 1926 general strike, or in China, the Chinese Revolution, 1926 to 27.
The ruling class of the world, particularly the ruling class of Europe, they were faced with a choice between revolution, the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism, or fascism. The way that Rosa Luxemburg, for example, posed it was the choice between socialism or barbarism.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, the capitalists went with barbarism.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you take Mussolini as an example, right? You have all of northern Italy engulfed in strikes. Workers are occupying the factories. Basically, there's a revolution and the workers have the chance to seize power. And in this moment, the capitalists, obviously, they need something to back themselves up. A battering ram, basically. And in stepped Mussolini with his black shirts, who would then go around smashing up workers' meetings, attacking picket lines, and so on. And this become the role of that they play for the capitalists. And then, because they are unable to stabilize the situation, there's this March on Rome, which is more of a theater than a real political event. Well, it's a staged, managed event. Mussolini doesn't even march himself. He rides in a train to Rome, and then marches just the last bit in to the city. But during this March of Rome, the king of Italy, which basically represents the interest of the Italian ruling class at this time, hands the premiership of Italy to Mussolini. Basically gives him the chance to form a government and rule Italy. So they hand power to Mussolini and his black shirts, basically, with the obvious aim of smashing up the working class, destroying the workers' organizations, which he then proceeds to do. setting up concentration camps on Italian islands and work camps and these kind of things where the communists and the socialists and trade unions get sent off to.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of our first episodes in this season, we dealt with Elon Musk and Alice Weidel, a leader of the AfD right-wing party in Germany, saying that actually Hitler was a socialist, Hitler was a communist. And this is quite a common talking point amongst not just the right wing, but also liberals and reformists attacking communists, saying, well, actually, Nazism and communism are exactly the same. And, you know, it's not called the National Socialist Party for nothing. And it's true in Mussolini's case that he was originally a member of the Socialist Party.
Yeah.
But, and this is the point that we always stress, you have to look at what his supporters did and what he did in power. So even before he came to power, they went around torching workers' clubs, cultural centres, murdering, assassinating trade unionists, left-wing politicians. They also burned down the Byron Hotel in Ravenna, which was this amazing Renaissance landmark, which had become a cooperative store for workers, and they burned that down. And then once he came to power, he carried out policy that favoured the wealthy industrialists and the landlords, privatizations, liberalisation of rent laws, dismembering the trade unions. So you see by his actions whose interests he really served.
Yeah, and what is the essence really of a trade union in the workplace? It's an element of workers' power within capitalism. The workers have a chance by organising together to fight back and protect their workers, their conditions, their wages and so on. And what you do is when the fascists come in and smash these organisations, is you basically smash the workers' ability to resist the onslaught of the capitalist class. So they can introduce the wages they want, they can use the working conditions they want, the speed ups, anything, and the workers are powerless to resist. And this is precisely what happened in Italy after Mussolini took power. So it's not a regime for the workers at all. It's the very opposite. It's the regime for the fiat owners and so on.
Well, it's funny that you should mention fiat because, as a quick aside, there are a number of capitalist entities and companies that are still powerful and wealthy today that have an extremely dark legacy of directly funding and abetting Mussolini in Italy and also Hitler in Germany. And the following is a non-comprehensive, non-exhausted list of these companies: IG Farben, Krupp, Volkswagen, BMW, Deutsche Bank, Fiat, as you mentioned, Pirelli, Ansaldo, and Banco di Roma. And relatively early on, the political magazine that Mussolini set up when he was really turning to the right and he was beginning to announce his intentions, Il Popolo d'Italia, the people of Italy, it was funded with money received from pro-war heads of the big Italian industrial sector, including Edison, Fiat, and also the steel, coal, energy giants, Ansaldo. So very early on, the capitalists threw money at Mussolini because they saw that he could be potentially useful.
Yeah, and obviously where he started off and how he broke with the socialist movement was on the question of war. The Italian Socialist Party opposed, at least to some extent, they opposed Italian war efforts, and they opposed the Italian entry into the war, First World War. And Mussolini, he broke with the party on that question and was expelled from the party. He became basically an ardent Italian nationalist, and that's where you get his links and with the big industrialists who want to fund the war, want to support the war, and they found this guy who knows a little bit how to talk to the workers. He superficially can appear as one of the workers and so on.
Yeah, an effective demagogue, you could say.
Precisely. He is much more than if you put some manager from Fiat to try to accomplish the same thing. It would be a much more effective tool in the hands of a bourgeoisie.
I think it's also important over the course of this discussion that we really defend the honour of the working class over this period. We'll talk about it in relation to Germany. But you can see at the crest of the revolutionary wave in particular, the fascists were utterly incapable of making any real serious headway into the working class. You see in the elections in Milan in 1919, the fascists only obtained 2% of the vote. And this is a common feature. There's never really a point where even the strongest fascist movements are able to achieve anything like a majority amongst the working class.
No, by no means. I mean, can maybe go into Germany a bit later, but the same is true there. You have Hitler. He starts his support in the countryside and then gradually moves into the cities. But there he doesn't get the workers' district. The layers he gets support with is the professionals, civil servants and so on, teachers actually, university lecturers, professors and so on, were early supporters of Nazism. But then small shopkeepers, clerks in companies and in states, eventually also some of the unemployed. Out of the unemployed, I think he picks up about half the support and the communist part of the other half.
This is a point that came out in our discussion last week with Alan Woods about World War II. A point that Alan made is that Mussolini also enjoyed praise from the heads of the main imperialist nations.
Yeah.
Far from this myth about World War II being fundamentally a titanic clash between the democratic Western powers, the Americans and Europe, allied against Nazi authoritarian barbarism. In 1927, Winston Churchill said the following of Mussolini: "I could not help being charmed, like so many other people have been, by his gentle and simple bearing, his calm, detached poise, in spite of so many burdens. If I had been an Italian, I'm sure that I should have been wholeheartedly with you from start to finish in your triumphant struggle against the bestial appetites and passions of Leninism," which is quite a useful quote, really, because it shows the attitude of the imperialists at this time. Better Mussolini than Bolshevism. And then a bit later, in 1933, and talking about a figure who's got some popularity amongst the reformist layers and the liberals, FDR wrote the following: "There seems to be no question that Mussolini is really interested in what we are doing, and I am much interested and deeply impressed by what he has accomplished and by his evidenced honest purpose of restoring Italy." What has he accomplished by this point? He smashed the working class, reduced them to raw material for exploitation. He's abolished democracy in Italy and established a brutal dictatorship. And that's being celebrated by, one of the most celebrated American presidents in the so-called democratic USA.
Yeah, well, Winston Churchill didn't do as far a job as Mussolini, but he had ambitions to accomplish something similar during the general strike in Britain. He was the one who led the organization of the volunteers, the strike-breaking force, in 1926. So that Churchill finds common ground with Mussolini is not really all that surprising. There's obviously another, which is the question of the alliances, that Britain was looking for an alliance with Italy against Germany to some extent, and that was partly why they were flirting with him, other than the fact that they have, in the struggle between the working class and the capitalist class, or between communism and capitalism, obviously these guys find themselves on the side of the capitalist, which means they're on the side of fascism and Nazism. They had a very soft policy all the way up until 1939 towards Hitler as well, when they the famous appeasement policy, which wasn't just a misguided attempt at averting war. It was actually a policy to try to to appease Hitler and try to make him attack the Soviet Union, because they saw in him common ground against Bolshevism, basically. So this is the way that things play out in the 1930s. The ruling class is looking towards fascism in order to use them as a battering ram against the Soviet Union, against the working class, and against its organizations.
Well, maybe now's time to move to Germany, because the rise of fascism in Italy is relatively rapid, you could say.
Yeah.
It's only a couple of years between the Bianco Rosso, the 2 red years, the revolutionary period, and Mussolini's March on Rome, which, as you say, it wasn't really a march on Rome because he took the train with the support of the king and the major industrialists. All the papers also were welcoming him to restore order. But it took a bit longer in Germany, between the revolutionary wave that broke out in 1918 and the consolidation of Nazi power in the early 1930s. What's the reason for the more protracted establishment of fascist power in Germany?
Well, capitalism in Germany was far more developed, and with that development of capitalism also comes this development of the working class, which was in Germany at that time far stronger than Italy. I think out of the major imperialist countries, Germany was probably the second strongest working class after Britain.
Second biggest communist party as well, I believe, after Russia.
Yes, that's right. And obviously, before the war, they had the strongest, numerical terms, the strongest social democratic party as well. It was a very strong trade union movement and so on. And this had certain implications even after the revolution is defeated in 1924. There wasn't possible for them to simply introduce a dictatorship straight away, but rather they had to buy their time to some extent before the moment the capitalists were able to strike. And also the boom helped basically enable them to give them a little bit of breathing space so that they didn't have to move against the working class straight away. But obviously that changed with the Wall Street crash of 1929. And this is when you have then the situation becoming sharp again. And the temporary breathing space is gone. I mentioned a little bit before, but the effect that it's had in the countryside was dramatic. The cities were affected a little bit later, but straight away in the countryside, and that after the crash, you have a massive wave of farms being repossessed by the big banks. And here we have to think about, the myth of the Jewish banker and all this stuff. The presence of Jewish people in the banking sector, which Hitler used in order to try to claim that the Jews were the source of the problem, international finance capital, international Jewry, and so on, as he talked about, and blamed them for the problem. And he found the basis in the crisis that was occurring in the countryside, with lots of farms being repossessed by the banks. And so that's then when you see the Nazis becoming from a quite an insignificant force in elections to reaching, I think, about 20 or 18 or 20%.
Yeah, there was an election in September 1930.
That's right.
Where the National Socialist Workers' Party did extremely well. The Social Democrats' vote declined since 1928 by 6%, but the Communist vote had risen considerably by 40% to 4.5 million. The Nazi Party, by contrast, had increased its votes to 6.5 million, becoming the second largest party in the Reichstag. So essentially, it's the main opposition party. However, it still doesn't have as many votes as the SPD, the Social Democrats, and the Communist Party together. So it begs the question...
Nowhere near, actually.
Nowhere near. So it begs the question, in this context where you've got this capitalist-backed, violent, and openly anti-worker, anti-communist party that is knocking on the door of power. And we should say as well, Hitler had an armed militia to hand. It wasn't as though it was just a political question.
Yeah.
The Nazis by this point already had the brown shirts. They already had forces modelled on Mussolini's black shirts that were their strong arm, who would go around harassing workers, harassing trade unionists and communists and suspected communists, and of course Jews and other groups as well. So a very serious threat. It begs the question at this moment, why on earth are the communists and the social democrats not putting aside their differences and unifying to fight this common enemy?
There's two answers to that question. One from the point of view of social democracy and one from the point of view of the Communist Party. And the first, I'm just start with social democracy. Their policy, they had a symbol, which were the three arrows. And there was one arrow against Nazism, okay? One arrow against monarchy or monarchist reaction, okay? And then the third arrow was against communism. And what you get from that, basically, the recipe of the social democracy for the crisis was this is a capitalist crisis, and as part of capitalist crisis, you have to carry out certain austerity measures, you have to make cuts, the workers have to tighten the belts and so on. And this is just a natural part of a crisis. And after that has passed, then obviously if we can get capitalism rolling again, get the wheels in motion, it's very much similar to if you look at how Starmer reacts to the crisis now, for example, right? Yeah, we got a problem with the budget, so we got to tighten our belts, right? And attack the working class. Basically, the policy they had was to make the workers pay for the crisis. And the way to do that, obviously, to try to prop up at the same time the democratic bourgeoisie. So essentially like lesser evilism. So the liberals and so on, which they had been collaborating with before, it wasn't a new thing, but they were trying to form, constantly supporting governments which involved liberals and the conservatives in order to stop, on the one hand, the communists from getting an influence, and on the other hand, the Nazis from getting an influence. But much like the lesser evilism of today, the greater evil often became the lesser evil. Mm-hmm. So what was the lesser evil? The greater evil in the 1920s, this is President Hindenburg, who was a reactionary monarchist, being at the head of the German army during the First World War, a real reactionary type. And he was the greater evil when they were supporting bourgeois candidate in the 1920s. Become the early 1930s, suddenly he's the lesser evil that need to be supported against Hitler. And this when the last time he stood in 1932, which is here, a year after, and the Social Democrats supported him against the two other candidates, which was the Communist Party candidate and the Nazi candidate, and they supported then the Hindenburg. And 1 year later, Hindenburg had basically handed power to Hitler by appointing him chancellor.
I don't want to make a direct comparison because we're not at this stage yet, but the mentality reminds me very much of something Yanis Varoufakis said a few years ago when it was a question of an election in France between Emmanuel Macron, who is a bourgeois in the pocket of the rich, has carried out massive attacks on working people for years, absolutely despised, versus Marine Le Pen. And he was saying very proudly, I consider myself a Marxist, I'm a socialist, and I understand that we have a responsibility to stand with the noble reactionary against the fascist, because that's what a responsible socialist has to do. So really the mentality of reformists and social democrats doesn't seem to have changed very much in the subsequent 80 years.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, it's or the supporting Biden against Trump,
right?
And so on. It's the same kind of thing now. Neither Le Pen nor Trump are fascist, but the logic of how they behave is exactly the same, and the consequences are not as dire. But the consequences in terms of political confusion, the lack of political alternative are the same. So basically it leaves a massive vacuum, because where are the workers supposed to go, right? Or workers, or even the petty bourgeoisie, who are looking for a way out of the crisis, where are they supposed to turn to? And Trotsky makes this point in his article. He says, look, the petty bourgeoisie, they've lost their faith in democracy, and they're looking for a way out in this crisis. As I say, all these farmers, they're losing their farm, the shopkeepers losing their shops, and so on. Butchers, all kinds of people. I mean, they're losing their livelihoods. They're desperate, and they're looking for a way out. And the Social Democrats are basically saying, "Look, this is just capitalism. This is how it works.
Them's the brakes. Sorry, guys."
Yeah, this is part of the proletarianization of society, and it's all. They even adopted this kind of pseudo-Marxist justifications for their actions. So obviously what that means is then that they open the field basically for Hitler to go to his people and say, well, I got the solution to these problems. I got the solution, and the problem is these Jewish people, it's these banks and so on, and this is the problem, and I got a solution for it. It doesn't, of course, it's all demagogy, but inaction, their inability to present an alternative, basically open the door. And there is a strong resemblance there of what's happening today. Basically, if the left supports Macron against Le Pen, then what are you telling all those people who are sick and tired and want change, want something different? You're telling them, well, there is no difference other than Le Pen. She is the only person who has a different idea of where to go forward. The consequences then is obviously that these people who you're trying to stop going to Le Pen, you're basically handing them over to her.
Yeah, the way Trotsky puts it is, under the impact of the crisis, the petty bourgeois swung as a consequence of what you described, not in the direction of the proletarian revolution, because no one was presenting that as an option, but in the direction of the most extreme imperialist reaction. And again, I think it's worth pointing out, first of all, illustrating the scale of the crisis. In Germany, unemployment rose to 4 million in 1931 and 5 million in 1932, over 6 million in the following year. Inflation had already thrown a big layer of the middle classes into utter ruin. And when we say inflation, but even in the teeth of this extreme crisis, the Nazis still failed to win support amongst organised labour. In 1931, there was another election where they only got about 5% of the vote in the factory committees. And in March 1933, despite all their efforts, that vote share had declined to 3%. So Hitler, again, like Mussolini, he never managed to break into the working class, at least its conscious and organised elements.
No, you can look at the voting figures as well. In spite of all the portrayals of social democracy, about half of the votes that Social Democrats lost went to the Communist Party. And it wasn't still, I think the last election, which in some way can be classified as free, 1929, I think they were still together, the two workers' parties were on the Communists and the Social Democrats together had something like 37% of the vote, which was more than Hitler got. So there was still a core the working class vote more or less held up. It was the middle classes that was turning towards Nazism, and the capitalists, of course.
So we've talked about the betrayals of the Social Democrats. Again, just like in Italy, the industrialists were heavily supporting Hitler. I talked about this in an episode that we did with Fred a few weeks ago, Fred Weston, where we talked about Tyson, for example, who was the head of the Steel Trust, who eventually wrote a book called I Paid Hitler, where he talked about giving money to the Nazis in order to create this bastion against the working class.
Just one point there, at the first, just about the way that the ruling class saw it. At the first, they saw it as a lever to use, or they didn't want to put Hitler in power. They were trying to use him as a lever against the working class, but leave him out of power. Yeah,
Papen said that we hired him for that task, was the way that von Papen, who was Chancellor in 1932, I think, put it. So
there was a little clique that became to dominate German government, which was based around a number of generals. There was Kurt von Schleicher being one of the main ones, and Hindenburg being another one, the president. And they basically were trying to maneuver. First, they were trying to maneuver to get Hitler to vote for their government, but Hitler refused to do that. Then they tried to split the Nazi party, leaning on a guy called Strasser, who is known for Strasserism, which is the sort of more socialist inverted commas element. But anyway, they were trying to lean on him, but Hitler outmaneuvered them inside the party and basically blocked them from splitting the party. And that then forced them, in this heightened crisis, the Nazis were also losing money, and they were basically bankrupt by the end of 1932. So they were also facing the threat that maybe the pendulum would swing back towards the working class, back towards the socialists, and in particular the communists. And at that point is when they decide to put Hitler as chancellor. Still thinking they could control him, which they failed to do, but they put him in power. And that was very much, although it was Hindenburg and von Papen who was very much involved in the maneuverings behind the scenes, they clearly did so with the backing of the German ruling class.
Let's talk about the other side of the leadership of the workers' movement. Let's talk about the communists.
Yeah.
What were they doing in the course of these developments?
Obviously, the Social Democrats, the whole period, starting from the German Revolution, they betrayed the revolution. They used a precursor to the fascists, the so-called Freikorps, these military officers and so on, petty bourgeois military officers who, with guns and so on, went around fighting communists wherever they could, and Social Democrats used them against the communists and greenlit the assassination of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. It's fairly well established. They were very conscious of it and allowed it to take place. And this, obviously, and then the betrayals throughout the 1920s and so on. But the Communist Party, and here it gets a bit complicated because of the Communist International, which had, at this point, we're talking about the late 20s, was controlled basically by the state bureaucracy of the Soviet Union. I think this has been discussed in other episodes. I've been here myself talking about it. But
we can go back over it, that's okay.
Up until 1928, this clique around Stalin, involving Bukharin and Rykov in particular, they were leaning towards the right. They was leaning on the so-called NEP men. They were telling the peasants to get rich, or the farmers to get rich in the Soviet Union, and this kind of thing. Or they talked about proceeding towards socialism at a snail's pace. This was the line that was being put forward, and alongside of that came class collaborationism, and not as bad as it was to be later on in the 1930s, but nonetheless, working with Chiang Kai-shek in China, working with the tops of the trade unions in Britain, making all kinds of diplomatic agreements with them and so on.
Anglo-Russian Committee.
Yes, that's right, which served to cover the arse of the leaders of the TUC during the general strike, and so on, which Trotsky was very critical of. But 1928, there was basically a strike of the kulaks, the rich peasant or rich farmers who were refusing to bring the grain to the market, and which caused famine in the cities. And this was an attempt at restoration of capitalism in Russia. And at this point, the bureaucracy was unwilling to go along with that, and they resisted. And the way that they did that was by switching 180 degrees from this quite opportunist right-wing policy based on the right of the party to 180-degree turn where they adopted a lot of the program of the left opposition, whilst at the same time, of course, suppressing the left opposition. But they adopted a lot of the program, and that followed also a left-wing shift in the International. So by in 1928, you have then what they call the third period of the Communist International. Partly it was true, but the way that they thought it through was wrong. The timing was wrong in the sense they started in 1928, not in 1929 or 1930 after the Wall Street crash. But in 1928, they then declared that now it's a struggle for power, it's on the agenda, and so on, and they turned all the communist parties from having had an alliance with the sort of trade union leaders and this kind of thing, right? 180 degrees towards attacking the Social Democrats as being social fascists.
We should say, in absolute fairness, the Social Democrats, as you say, had not that long previously manoeuvred with these extremely reactionary paramilitary units to murder the leaders of the KPD, the leaders of the Communist Party.
And they continued.
So you can understand where that sentiment would come from the rank and file at the very least.
Yeah, it's had some... You could see that when you talked about them, like communists, I talked about them using... they would become... like the fascists, right? Well, they kept saying the moderate wing of fascism was one of the phrases that Stalin used, which was then repeated. And in 1929, before the Wall Street crash, in 1st of May 1929, the communists organized a demonstration, which was banned by the Social Democratic government of Prussia. And then it was when the communists went ahead anyway, I think in a bit of an adventurous manner, but nonetheless, they were shot at by the police, and the Social Democratic chief of police endorsed the whole thing. They killed something like, I can't remember how many died, but it was a number of workers who got killed, like 15, 20 or something like that. So you could see there was an element of truth to what they were saying, in the sense of, well, it appeared at least as, well, maybe they aren't so different, the Social Democrats and the fascists. You could have an appearance, but Trotsky points out that this is not sufficient. Like, it's a bit of a like an emotional response to the whole thing, and we must have a scientific understanding of how these things take place. But the consequence anyway of this was, you adopt this thing of calling them social fascists and so on, was that you make no distinctions between the social democrats and the social democratic trade unions and the fascists, which means that they're all the same, more or less. So the idea of having a united front, like you mentioned, like why don't you unite the social democrats and obviously that becomes anathema, because how can you unite with the fascists against the fascists? It doesn't make any sense. It even goes to this, they even in effect make the social democrats the bigger enemy. So between the Nazis and the social democrats, because the social democrats are the deceivers of the working class, they're the bigger enemy.
Yes.
And so it's more important to fight them than to fight the Nazis.
Right.
Which leads to the extreme measures that they make alliances. In the early 1930s, they're joining forces with the Nazis to beat up social democrats, break up their meeting, attack their meetings, and so on.
Yes, and this is historical record. This did happen. There were collaborations between the Communist Party and the Brown Shirts, as you say, to sabotage social democratic meetings, extreme sectarianism, and completely insane.
And obviously the Social Democrats, they had no interest in joining forces with the communists against the Nazis whatsoever. So obviously what they do, in any instance they find like that, big or small, they will blow it up and use it in order to basically justify their own opposition to the communists, like basically anything that the communists and the Nazis are the same, and they would say to the rank of a social democracy. That's the meaning of the three arrows. The communism and Nazis the same. Today we call it the horseshoe theory.
Yeah. Well, one particular incident I wanted to highlight that gave the social democratic leaders some ammunition. In 1931, the KPD, so the Communist Party, joined forces with Stahlhelm, which was an armed veterans organization tied to the monarchist German National People's Party, and the Nazis, attempting to oust the Prussian Social Democratic government in a referendum.
Yeah.
So they joined forces to attack the Social Democratic-controlled Prussian government with Nazis and far-right monarchists following the line of this third period madness. And it played directly into the hands of the leaders of the social democracy, because it was very easy for them to say to their members, these insane communists are literally in a political alliance against our government in Prussia with the Nazis and the monarchists.
Yeah, and obviously the workers might not have, a lot of the workers probably did not have great illusions in the social democracy, but they probably thought, well, the social democracy is like, well, at least it's our party and so on. They didn't have great illusions they were going to achieve socialism or even any significant reforms. They probably knew the Social Democratic leaders, but they did not trust the communists. And obviously things like this wound up just lowering the authority or really sowing poison against the communists, allowing the Social Democratic leaders to sow poison against the Communist Party in the rank and file or amongst the wider working class that were voting for the Social Democrats. And so it was, from that point of view, of trying to win over, which was the task of the Communist Party. I mean, they were correct to say, well, they weren't correct in 1928, but after 1929, at least that part of the thing was correct. It was a struggle for power that was on the agenda, but how do you get there? How do you actually, it was a question of capitalism or socialism or fascism or socialism. That was correct. That was on the agenda. But how do you get there? How do you get to the struggle? How do you get to the workers to take power? Well, you got to win. The Communist Party has to win the authority over the working class. It's not enough to have 15 or even 20% support in the working class if 25% are still under the influence by social democracy. You cannot win, take power under those conditions. And so to win over the working class, you have to find a way to raise your authority in their eyes, to show that you have ideas of how to take the struggle forward. And obviously one of the crucial battles in this time was against Hitler, against the Nazis, which were a physical threat. They were attacking trade union meetings, they were attacking social democratic meetings and communist meetings, of course. And they were doing this, particularly after when they were legalized again, because they were banned for a period, but when they were legalized again and really unleashed on the working class in the summer of 1932, well then really it should have been an open and shut case. That referendum, by the way, the local Communist Party was opposed to take the line that they took. But they were overruled by the national leaders of the Communist Party, who basically were more under the pressure of the party line, so to speak, or this third period madness. So there were instances as well of where local Communist Party and local social democratic branches and members, they would try to join up, try to link up to fight together against the fascists, and this did happen, but it was actively sabotaged. And Trotsky makes this point: they were actively sabotaging it from the point of view of the leadership, because they were trying to stop. They were against these kind of rank and file initiatives, probably fearing that they would, from the point of view of Communist Party leaders, fearing that the power over the party would slip out of their hands.
And another thing that comes out of Trotsky's writings and your introduction, which is so tragic and frustrating to read, is that the leaders of the Communist Party and the bureaucrats in Moscow even belatedly begin to realize some of the errors of the strategy, and they try to move in a different direction, but they completely bungle that as well, because they continue for a while to still refuse to seek a united front in terms of the trade union struggle, but they sue for a cross-class, cross-party parliamentary coalition involving the SPD and the Centre Party. They basically...
in some Bundesländer, like in the... we call it like state parliaments.
Right, exactly.
They involve themselves in order to keep the Nazis out. But then you're joining, it's not just the Workers' United Front, it's not just in alliance with the workers' parties, but it's merely a parliamentary coalition. So it's not a fighting coalition, which involves social democratic and communist workers fighting side by side for a particular set of demands or against the fascists, or like a practical fighting program. It's a parliamentary cartel, a parliamentary coalition, and it stays at that level. So you get the kind of worst of both worlds in reality. And it is with a bourgeois party involved as well,
yes,
right? The Liberal Party. So basically that's a kind of precursor for what you had later on with the Popular Front.
And then eventually the Communist Party issue an appeal to the German trade union movement for joint action in defense of proletarian interests. But as Trotsky explains, by that point it was already, while technically correct, it was kind of too little too late, because they'd so completely disorientated their members. They'd alienated the rank and file of the SPD, and all that really did was expose the inconsistency of their previous strategy. All that really did was show how ridiculous their previous approach had been, and it was a bit of a flop, basically.
Yeah, I mean, the expression "too little, too late" comes to mind, right? You have 1931, them having participated basically in the right-wing attempt to depose the Prussian government, which is a social democratic government of Prussia, which is half the country. By July 1932, through a coup, this is Papen's government, they removed the social democratic government simply by decree, presidential decree, no vote in parliament or anything, and they simply removed the social democratic government of Prussia. Again, half the country we're talking about here, and some of the most industrialized areas, including Berlin, of course. And at that point, the Communist Party then say, right, let's launch a general strike against this coup. Now, it was correct to have a general strike against the coup, but given that they just 9 months earlier had attempted to remove it together with it just seems completely inconsistent, like they don't know what they're doing, which is true. This was an inconsistent policy, and basically they were, and then they didn't explain it either. They did not explain it to the members and nowhere else either why they were suddenly doing this as opposed to what they were doing 9 months before. So the whole thing just becomes rather more confusing than anything, right? I mean, if you're there as a Communist Party militant, you must think, what is going on? Like, how does this fit in what... I mean, maybe it makes sense to you, but what... I mean, and the social democratic workers, rank and file workers, they'll be like, okay, maybe, but I mean, it just doesn't fit. And obviously it's still quite easy for the Social Democrats then to dismiss it and say, it's just a stunt. And you know what we need to do is to go through the courts, which is what the Social Democratic policy was always, to raise it in Parliament. I mean, the Parliament has become a joke at this point. I mean, and so this led nowhere. And this is this is the way the Social Democrats could then easily maneuver away these proposals, which really otherwise in different conditions would have, if there had been a consistent policy like that from the Communist Party, this would have had a real echo among rank and file Social Democrats, who would have, and trade unionists, who would have seen, no doubt, as we see today, whenever today the fascists are not nearly as strong, but when you see a little bit of an inkling of fascists raising themselves up and trying to threaten the working class and working class organizations or asylum centers and things like that, when that becomes a thing, then workers respond massively, and they would have done if there wasn't all this confusion and division and sectarianism which existed between the two parties at that time.
Yes. At the decisive moment, the social democratic leaders in particular are telling their rank and file, trust the process, trust in democracy, stay in your homes, don't risk any provocations, don't get into street battles. I think at one point the leader of the social democracy told his membership, look, we have the Iron Brigades, which were these armed workers' militias. They had about 1 million members, I think. I mean, it was a serious fighting force that outnumbered the forces that Hitler was able to muster on the street for a long period. Could have destroyed Nazism in the cradle. He said, look, we'll mobilize it if we have to, if it really comes down to it, and we're looking down the gun barrel of Nazi dictatorship, then we will use those forces. But of course he never did. The Social Democrats all the way through, and this was true of the Socialist Party in Italy actually, when Mussolini was on his way to power, they were going through the courts, they were insisting upon, we need legal methods. They were appealing, actually, to the Italian state for the government to do something about Mussolini. It's like, look, this guy's going around beating up our members and destroying our trade union offices. That's not allowed. That's illegal. And at the same time, and in Germany later, similar sort of thing. You have to trust in the official channels, trust in the institutions of democracy. We're going to beat Hitler at the ballot box. We're going to beat him at the Reichstag. You don't need to get into armed confrontations. It wasn't as though the working class was defenseless. There could have been an armed and victorious confrontation with fascism, but it was never allowed to happen.
Well, that's right. And obviously part of the problem there, like the Social Democrats, although some of them paid a heavy price, paid with their lives for their mistakes. But fundamentally, they were more worried about the effect that such a mobilization would have had on their rank and file, and what impact it would have had on the consciousness of the working class, and how they would have put them in the same. Basically, how they reignited the German Revolution. That was what they were worried about, and that's why they didn't want to do it. They felt they would unleash a movement that they could not control, and there's probably an element of truth to that. And they were fighting tooth and nail as a result to try to prevent it, with all kinds of excuses here, there, and everywhere. And it was true in Germany. It was also true in Austria and Italy, as you say, and many other places where it took place, constantly trying to hold back, trying to stop the movement from developing. Because obviously once the workers feel that they're strong, they're powerful and so on, it's very difficult then to tell them to, oh, no, you're weak and pathetic and you have to trust us to do the business when they haven't been able to do the business for such a long time.
Yeah, go back to the factories, go back to work, we'll take over from here.
It's anyone if you interview any workers and been involved in a struggle like that, I mean, for example, in the British miners' strike, you interview workers who were involved in that kind of struggle, and they say it completely transforms them. It changes them and their whole outlook on the world and so on. And that is obviously what they did not want to take place. They were desperately trying to avoid it. But they still wanted to make a show of being opposed to fascism, which were they held these rallies and whatever, but didn't actually take the serious step that were needed.
So, 30th of January 1933, Hitler is appointed Chancellor, as you explained. The night of the 27th of February 1933, the Reichstag is burned down. It's blamed on a communist, and it's used as an excuse by the Nazis to essentially launch their final seizure of power. Can we talk about that denouement?
Well, you can say it wasn't just the Nazis. I mean, the whole of the bourgeois establishment basically was the ruling class of Germany was out to get the Communist Party at this point. I mean, the working class in general, starting with the Communist Party. As you can see, what happened the next few months. So they start with the Communist Party. They unleash the SA, now working in together with the police openly on the Communist Party. They arrest them, they harass them, they basically stop. So there has been an election called as well. So the election takes place like maybe 2 weeks after this event. And they completely smash the Communist Party, any kind of activity that they could have in the elections. They legalize the party, and obviously their votes fell dramatically in the elections as a result.
Yeah, by about 1 million, I think.
Yeah, and even after that, then after the election, which also affected the votes of the Social Democracy. But even after election, then the deputies are basically prevented from taking their seats by the SA and the state, to basically arrest them should they show their face anywhere near Parliament. So they basically removed the Communist Party from the board, and now this basically puts Hitler pretty firmly in the saddle. But just to make sure, on the 23rd of March, they passed the Enabling Act, which basically give Hitler dictatorial powers. And that this is supported by all the bourgeois parties. The only party the communists were out of it, they couldn't vote. And they even had a vote in Parliament to declare that anyone who was not present at the vote, their votes would be counted as though they were present, or they would not form part of a quorum requirement. So basically, by a maneuver, they increased, because they needed like a 2/3 majority, qualified majority. So they did this by maneuver. Then the Social Democrats did not vote in favor, but half of them were in hiding, obviously fearing reprisals, and the rest were insufficient to stop when all the bourgeois parties voted to give, including the Centre Party, which was part of the Centre Party was trying to hold out, but they also capitulated and made some kind of deal with Hitler. The trade unions then go and make a deal with Hitler, basically saying, we won't defend social democracy. So the Social Democracy didn't defend the communists when they were attacked by Hitler. Now the trade unions say, we won't cause trouble if you attack the Social Democrats, as long as you keep us out of it, right?
First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out, for I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and so on and so on. Yeah,
and so then the trade unions, they, being a very bureaucratic mindset, leaders of social democratic trade unions, being social democrats themselves, they then try to make a deal with Hitler, which lasts for about 2 weeks. Then after the 1st of May, the Nazis organize a big parade and a success. They feel emboldened. There's no response from the labor movement whatsoever throughout this period and after the election. And then they go organize basically the smashing of all the trade union offices, the dismantling of the organizations, the banning of the trade unions and so on, and the whole thing just collapses. And that was the end of the German trade union movement. And it's like the whimper, basically. The most powerful working class movement in Europe was destroyed. I think was it Goebbels who bragged that they did it without breaking a single pane of glass or something like that.
Without breaking a window pane.
Window pane, yeah. And there was an element of truth to it. Probably not literally true, but it was an element of truth to it. And basically the powerful German labor movement did not use its might in order to prevent Hitler from establishing his dictatorship. And this is and the tragic consequences then followed.
Yeah, 130,000 communist members sent off to concentration camps, meeting their ends by gas chamber or beheading or torture, thousands of social democrats, thousands of trade unionists. And we said in this episode with Fred a few weeks ago that the first occupants of the first concentration camps that were established were communists and socialists, first of all, because, as we've been saying all the way through, the primary objective of fascism is to liquidate all impediments to capitalist rule, to annihilate the means by which the working class can defend themselves, and that meant destroying their parties, destroying their organizations.
And Hitler did, just like Mussolini had done before, he now did it in the most vicious and ruthless manner. Then followed, of course, some of the bourgeois politicians wound up in the same. You know, the stuff you hear about in history books, Jews, gay people,
Roma,
disabled, Roma, and all these things that followed in the subsequent years.
Yes.
But it started with the communists and the socialists and the trade unionists.
And when we say socialism or barbarism, this is what we mean.
Yeah.
Millions upon millions of people murdered in the most brutal way because, first and foremost, of the actions of the capitalists, the imperialists, the errors and crimes of the social democrats, and the ultra-left sectarian madness of the communist leaders. A great tragedy.
There's an article in this book which is titled precisely "The Tragedy of the German Proletariat," and this is precisely describes the horror of this event, but also the political reasons for why it ended in this way. And this was a seismic event which then had a massive impact on the consciousness of workers all around Europe.
Well, let's talk about the rest of Europe, because after 1933, 1934, and the disastrous defeats of the German working class, the focus of the workers of Europe shifts towards France, where on the 6th of February, gangs of fascists and monarchists organised a provocation, and this sets off an important political process. Could you give a bit of a background to the situation in France from 1934?
Yeah, so this is a government which is of the radicals.
Who were actually liberals, right?
They were
centre-ground party.
There's like the centre of, like, in middle of politics, like...
They were radically centre, which is a popular position for centrist dads today, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, it helps as a tradition, a particular historical tradition in France at that time. Now they're gone since this time. But they were backed by social democracy, and there was also all kinds of social democrats, including some of the radicals who called themselves socialists. But this government was embroiled in a corruption scandal. And basically the monarchists and the fascists tried to organize a coup, deposing it and replacing it with something more in their image. The working class, having seen what happened in Italy, having seen what happened in Germany, responded powerfully. And here we have actually, in practice, was formed a united front. So the kind of thing that Trotsky had been advocating was actually happened on the streets of France in the week following this. There was a big mobilization on the 9th of February, and then there was a powerful general strike on the 12th of February, and this stopped the coup in its tracks, basically, because the workers mobilized and prevented it from taking place. But that didn't solve the problem. I think this is important to understand, that just because you stop fascism, all the problems in society still remain, even if you stop them from taking power. And so what happens was, obviously, a government has to be formed of some sort, and in steps a radical who is now, from then on, ruling by decree powers.
And what's his name?
Dumergue. And so, and he is backed by two generals. So we have the army, just like in Germany. The army also stepped in and played a role now in government, not openly, but behind the scenes. And so you have Pétain, who you know from later on in the Vichy regime, and another guy, Végan, I think his name is, who was also part of the Vichy regime later on. And they become the two generals that are backing this new government. It's extremely unstable because of instability, but they basically they raise themselves up above the classes, above society in a sense, because of this paralysis between, on the one hand, the fascists and the monarchists mobilized, and on the other hand, the communists and the socialist workers. And so in the stalemate between those two, between the classes, basically, they can rise up and basically trying to balance. Trotsky describes this as balancing a cork on the head of a pin.
It's a bit of a visually confusing metaphor, but I get what you mean.
Yeah, well, you can talk about society being on a knife's edge and something is balancing on a knife edge, and I think that maybe
that's a little easier to get your head around. Yeah,
but you can see it's like basically the extreme tension in society creates these governments, but also extremely unstable governments. So the following governments in the next few years, they only last like a few months each before they collapse, and then there has to form another one and another one and another one. And until you have the formation of, until the election of 36, just taking one step back, and it's after the disaster in Germany, the Communist International makes another 180-degree shift back towards its previous policy, although now it's taken a bit further. And this is when you have talked about the Popular Front policy, right? Which is when they say, well, we're not just in favor of uniting with the workers' parties, but we also want to unite with the democratic bourgeois. So they have adopted now the policy of the German SPD. Yeah. Well, aside from the anti-communism, of course. But they, there is then a coalition formed between the radicals, or the left of the radicals, if you will, the Social Democrats, and the communists, and it's called the Popular Front. And they go to election in 1936, and they win quite convincingly. And this is obviously was the culmination of the French workers looking for a way out, and also finding and also the importance of the struggle against fascism, right? So these two thoughts that were obviously in the minds of the workers. But the crisis and the economic conditions and all the deprivation that are taking place, then obviously you then have the government which you feel is your own. This is our government. It's of the communists and socialists together. And they are there. They're going to stand by us, and they're going to, improve our lot and so on. And there was a program. They were elected, and so the workers are like, yeah, let's implement this program. Let's go ahead and do it. So they launched a massive strike wave, and this is the last thing that the Popular Front government want, because the whole idea behind, well, at least the socialist part of it, the whole idea behind it is to try to find an alliance with the bourgeoisie against the fascists.
Yes.
But what happens is, obviously, the workers, they go on strike. And why is it? Well, the bourgeois are not very keen on the workers going on strike, right? This is precisely what they're trying to... So the whole idea of the Popular Front is basically to try to stop the workers from going on the offensive. But this is precisely what happens. So stop the fascists, yes, but as part of that, to also hold back the working class, to stop them threatening the capitalists. But precisely what happens, because they get elected, the workers go on the offensive and they threaten the capitalists. Yeah. There's a massive strike wave, including factory occupations, what they call the sit-down strikes. And it's basically it's a revolutionary wave sweeps France. And so this puts the capitalists right up against the wall.
And actually, even before the Popular Front was elected, Trotsky predicted that it would be necessarily tested by class struggle, by crisis, and the fact that it was this unprincipled alliance would mean that it would splinter. He wrote in March, so the elections were in May 36, he wrote in March, in an article called France at the Turning Point, the People's Front, so the Popular Front, will fall to pieces at the first serious test, and deep fissures will open up in all of its component sections. The policy of the People's Front is the policy of betrayal. And yeah, that was prophetic.
He also described it as a strike-breaking conspiracy. And it will have been true, because the first thing that these leaders do then is to try to negotiate a deal. They're trying to find a deal, right, to try to extract some concessions from the capitalists, which obviously capitalists, feeling this massive movement, that they were going to lose everything. Yeah. That the workers were just going to seize the factories, never mind, asking for a wage increase, but seizing the factories, taking control of it, running it by themselves, like it happened in Russia.
Which could and should have been the policy of the Communist Party to...
That's right.
...agitate for.
And that was actually taking place in Spain as well, right? So this was what they feared. And obviously, to try to stop that from taking place, they would agree to anything. And they did agree to a whole raft of concessions, working conditions, wages, hours of work, all kinds of things. But this was, under the conditions of that time in France, completely unaffordable to them. And so Trotsky predicted, quite rightly, and he said, look, this is actually, rather than this being bringing the bourgeois closer to democracy, to bringing them, this is actually pushing them right in the opposite direction. You're actually pushing them towards fascism, because you now created a situation where where the working class has conditions which are completely incompatible with the profits of the capitalists. And so the only way forward for them is to it's to completely make a break and completely smash the working class. It's the only way for them to take a step forward. So obviously this was never the idea of the Popular Front leaders, whose idea was always to not do very much, except not be fascist. But obviously the working class had different ideas. For them, the two conditions as existed in the mid-1930s were intolerable, and they needed something. They needed these concessions. But the capitalists equally needed not to give those concessions. And this is the clash that took place, and where the Popular Front government, for their own fault, were caught in the middle.
So what's the consequence of that? What happens to the Popular Front government?
Well, the Popular Front government starts moving to the right after this event. The working class is basically demobilized and disoriented as a result. And this Popular Front government starts moving to the right. Eventually winds up then in the capitulation to Hitler.
The way that you put it in your introduction, I thought was really interesting. You said that the French bourgeoisie's capitulation to Hitler was their revenge. What do you mean by that? Yeah,
so rather than organizing a proper struggle against Hitler, basically they saw at a certain point during the first day, they attempted to fight, and it was a bit half-hearted, but they attempted to fight. But then they realized that actually, in the end, why not join them, right? And so basically they sit down and make a deal with Hitler, and Hitler solves some of their problems, but basically he gets rid of trade unions, he gets rid of the socialists, he gets rid of the communists.
By again smashing the organizations of the working class.
That's right. And even if in Vichy France, right, basically the conditions are such that they can accomplish the same things in those parts that are now controlled by the Vichy regime, which is its southeast and central parts of France now under control of the Vichy regime, if I remember correctly.
So basically what you're saying is, in order to save their system and to claw back the concessions they've had to give in the previous period, the French bourgeoisie hands over its people without a fight to the tender mercies of Hitler.
Yeah, and obviously one of the things they were thinking of is the Paris Commune. What happened when Germany beat France in the war, and the workers of Paris rose up, took over arms, rose up, and took over Paris.
The Versailles government taps Bismarck on the shoulder and says, help us sort this out, more or less.
And there is agreement between Versailles and Bismarck to allow Versailles to crush the Paris workers. And obviously this time France is far more developed, the working class is stronger, as evidenced by what has taken place, and this would not have been confined to Paris, and the struggle against fascism, as was later to be proven in the partisan movement, there would have been a widespread struggle. There was a possibility of a widespread struggle, but the bourgeois was not interested in that.
And I think it's really important here that we especially defend the honour of the French working class, because the unjust reputation foisted upon France as a whole today is that they just always wave the white flag as soon as they face any opposition, and they just surrendered to Hitler without a fight. No, the French workers were prepared and willing to fight the Nazis. It was the French capitalists, the French bourgeois, that capitulated without a fight. And the reason for that is that they saw that Hitler could achieve some jobs for them, could achieve some tasks for them.
And it was Pétain, Marshal Pétain, and the clique around him who signed the armistice agreement.
Yeah.
Who capitulated, basically. So it's the same people who involved already in 1934.
All right, Nicholas. Well, this has been a rather harrowing episode, but a very interesting discussion. And I want to return to the point that we started with, which is the lessons for today, because today you've got economic crisis, the rise of protectionism and economic nationalism, you've got extreme political polarization, society in ferment, and you've got people talking about the danger of fascism, and there are fascist organizations throughout the world that do pose a threat to working class people, to oppressed communities. You've got the Proud Boys in the USA, you have the EDL and Britain First, groups like that here in the UK. So just to sum up this discussion, how much of a threat is fascism now, and how far do these analogies with the 1930s go?
Well, I would say in local areas and so on, the fascists can be a real threat to workers where they are strong and they have a base and they mobilize for one reason or another. And obviously, the way to fight, in Greece some years ago, in Greece they were very strong. They had a party in parliament.
The Golden Dawn.
The Golden Dawn, yes. And they killed and assassinated a well-known hip-hop artist who was an anti-fascist. Mm-hmm. And the response of the Greek workers was basically, it was a mass demonstration, and it forced the ruling class of Greece to basically, because of the movement that was starting to develop, they forced the ruling class in Greece to basically put them in prison, quite rightly. And this is obviously, when this takes place, when the fascists do show their face, it must be the policy to immediately, mobilize against them, chase them away, and stop them from terrorizing local communities. Yeah. That must be the policy.
Yeah, organize, drive them out.
Yeah, and the Labour movement must take a lead in that. Yeah. And sadly, it does not do that. And in that sense, there's still the thing of, trust the police, trust the courts, and so on. No, don't do that. Trust in your own strength. Mobilize the workers, mobilize local trade unions, and so on. Mobilize the local community. And drive them out wherever they show their face.
And there's nothing else. There's plenty of evidence of sympathy in the state forces, the police in particular, for far-right organisations all over the world. So why on earth would you trust the police and the officialdom of the courts?
Well, and the other thing is that basically the ruling class, even today, although they have no plans of putting these guys in power, we should leave here Le Pen and those kind of characters separate to the fascists, because otherwise it wouldn't be possible to work out what's going on. But they will use them, and they will allow them to grow and use them as a threat, basically, as a thing of holding against migrants, holding against local labor movement and so on, and having it in the back pocket. A bit like that someone is funding Tommy Robinson is quite obvious. Yeah. Hey, this guy is not making any money in any normal way. Someone is paying him. I don't know how, but it's being done, right?
If you don't know Tommy Robinson, he's a far-right social media character, basically, and he spends his entire time, as Nicholas said, tweeting bile.
But he mobilized far-right thugs to come out and protest against immigrants in Britain in August, right? Yeah. And he's been part of it, at the center of these kind of mobilizations in Britain for a while. But you can see that someone is paying him, someone thinking this guy can be useful in the future and at the present. So for sure, you cannot rely on the state, because they're also a bit of hands off and the only time when they really, when the state does intervene and does do something about these guys is when they can be killing people, they can be beating people up, they can be torching asylum centers, whatever. And the only time the state does something about it is when they can feel that there's a threat that otherwise the workers or the labor movement or young people will take matters into their own hands. Mm-hmm. And then they obviously rather than the people take matters into their own hands, they would rather do it themselves to keep it under control, basically. So there should be no trust in these people. But I think there is a difference there between the fascists, who should be dealt with these kind of methods, and then what you call reactionary parties, which are growing with anti-immigrant programs and so on, racist reactionary programs. Those, I think, should be dealt with a bit differently. And there it is very important not to fall into the same mistakes of the Popular Front or of the German social democracy, not because we're dealing with fascists, but precisely because what is happening is that and now we're dealing partly with a layer of the working class as well. That is looking for a way out of a crisis, and the solution cannot then be to sort of huddle together with liberals
And to defend democracy.
well, defending the status quo, right?
Yeah.
Cuts and austerity and so on. Capitalism, democracy today means cuts, austerity, attacks on working class people, even attacks on democratic rights, attacks on trade unions and so on.
People protesting against the genocide in Gaza, being arrested and deported.
Yeah,
that was happening under Biden. It's happening under Starmer.
Yeah, I mean, this is democracy. And so how can... This is basically what bourgeois democracy has to offer today. And how can we then say, oh, no, what we need is to defend this against like a slightly worse form of the same thing, or sometimes not even that much worse at all. This cannot be our policy. Our policy must be to provide an alternative, and in that sense, there is a similarity. Like the policy must be to fight to defend workers' rights, to defend concrete gains for the working class. Also to find united front where the fascists show that. This must be the policy. Rather than trying to prop up basically the establishment, the liberals, the centre ground, centre left, whatever you might want to call them, the centre right, whatever phrase you want to use. It's not our job to support them when they're sinking, basically because of their own policies. But our job is to provide an alternative.
If nothing else, because one thing history does teach us is that when it comes down to it, they see us, as in the communists, the working class, as the greater evil as compared to the fascists and the reactionaries. When it really comes down to it, once their system is in extreme crisis and the class struggle becomes intractable, given the choice, the powers that be, and the liberals, we should say, always see the threat of revolution by the working class as a greater danger, as a worse fate than having democracy abolished.
Or at the best, they are powerless to stop it.
Right.
The only force that can really stop it is the working class. There are some well-meaning liberals, but they're completely at sea in this situation. There's nothing to base themselves on. What can capitalism deliver to people? This is the problem. If you're trying to defend the status quo, what does that have to offer for working class people today? Very little or nothing, except more attacks and worsening of their living standards.
I guess the last thing we should say is that two things that are somewhat different today is, one, the ruling class has sort of learned the dangers of going down the route of dictatorship and fascism, because it was a disaster for Germany in the end. Nazi rule brought the country to ruin. It was torn in half. Big sections of its industry were levelled. It lost millions upon millions of its citizens. It was an absolute disaster. They won't go down that route readily again. We don't want to say absolutely never, ever, but certainly in the immediate term, they won't be going down that route. And the other thing we should say is the working class today is a lot stronger, and that's an important factor as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you look today and you look at the fascists, I mean, we'll start with the strength of the fascists. They are, we talk about the real fascists, the SA, right? The Sturmabteilung, as they were called. What do they, their equivalents today, right? The Proud Boys in the United States, for example, they are, I would say, more or less equivalent. How many could they muster? 500, 1,000, maybe 2,000? At most, these groups in the US could probably muster 10,000. The SA was 100,000, 200, up to 1 million at its height of its strength. This is completely different kind of level of strength and the threat that they pose. And if you compare it to Black Lives Matter protests in the United States, involved tens of millions of people. So the balance of forces between these reactionary forces and the working class is completely different, which makes it very difficult for the ruling class to go down the road of like, yeah, we're going to base ourselves on these. I mean, how is 10,000 people going to, even if they're really right-wing and determined, going to impose themselves on a society of 300 million? It's just not going to work, even if they get the help of the state. They cannot do it. So it's a completely different scenario from that point of view. And the working class numerically, and it's a reflection basically of how the working class numerically has developed over these past, well, since the Second World War, where it's so much stronger now. And those layers in society have been completely devastated by development of capitalism and been turned into workers. We talked about professors, teachers, students, all these people now would tend towards the left. I mean, they'd be in the unions, they wouldn't be the strike breakers, as they were in the British General Strike, or they wouldn't be joining the fascists, but they would be tending towards the left. The trade unions would tend to be on the left, and so on. They're quite militant, many of these unions. Civil servants, teachers, university lecturers, depending on the country, of course. And this reflects like how these layers have become much more closer to the working class, been drawn closer into the working class than before, as well as the overwhelming numerical strength of the working class. We're all, the people working in shops today, they don't own their own shop. They work in their shop, which is owned by a big multinational company, and so on. And this just creates a different balance of force in society, in which the ruling class has to take into consideration. They cannot simply resort to the measures of dictatorship and fascism like they did in the 20s and 30s.
No. Obviously, as you say, we take the threat of fascist groups at a local level extremely seriously, but in terms of the way that we organise and fight against today's reactionaries, our approach is different. And the final thing we should say is there was already an alternative presented before the rise of fascism the last time around. The Russian Revolution sparked a wave of revolutionary struggle all over the world, which, as you say, sadly was defeated in one country after another. But it was precisely that threat of their system being abolished on the world stage and the establishment of a different form of society that helped terrify the ruling class into supporting the forces of black reaction. But it's that alternative society, it's the end of capitalism and for socialism and communism that we're fighting, right? That's the alternative that we're after.
Yeah, so the only way, I mean, we can talk about, well, there's no threat of fascism and so, but there is no particular threat of fascism at this moment in time. But if you look at society, there's plenty of other reasons. And this question, what Rosa Luxemburg said, socialism or barbarism, well, you can see that very graphically today in the world. If you look around what capitalism has done to Gaza, capitalism and imperialism destroying Gaza, they've destroyed half of Ukraine, Sudan, and so on, all these disasters, which are the direct consequences of capitalism and imperialism. So it's the future for humanity under capitalism looks very bleak. And so the need to struggle, just like in the 1930s, the real struggle and what we need to fight for is the same. Fundamentally, there's the same problem. You've got capitalism in crisis and the desperate need for an alternative, for a socialist society.
All right, thanks, Nicholas. That was fantastic. One more time, I want to invite all of our viewers to pre-order their copy of Democracy, Bonapartism and Fascism, Class Struggle in the 1930s from Well Read Books. I'll put a link in the description. As I said earlier, Nicholas has written the introduction. It's an excellent series of essays and articles that will give you a much more thorough understanding of fascism than the hysterical nonsense that you'll read in the bourgeois press. The last thing that I want to say before we call time on today's episode is that next week will be our final episode of the season, and we'll be speaking to Hamid from the Revolutionary Communist International's leadership, and also host of the Against the Stream podcast, talking about Marxist philosophy and why we need theory. Nicholas, it's been great having you on.
Thank you. It's been great to be here.
And we'll see you all next week for our final episode of Season 4. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
A spectre is haunting Europe. The spectre of communism.
Communism is stronger, more determined than ever.
Communist.
Communism. The communists.
The communists.
The communists.
Dedicated to the establishment of a new order.
Just what is communism?
I'll guarantee that 10 minutes from now, a lot of you are going to have a new understanding of communism.